I've pulled out of the archives a little bit. When I was a school counselor in the early 2000s or so, I got involved with government relations through the Georgia School Counselors Association. I hadn't done anything like that before, and I found I was really needed to learn a lot about what it meant to be involved in government relations. And one of the things that was really challenging for me was learning how to have conversations with legislators. When you do this kind of work, you have to have your points condensed down to very concise kind of elevator speeches so that you can deliver your argument quickly, succinctly, and in a way that that's also backed by research or by data as well. And so I'm going to talk about how I sort of came up with this formula of 3RT and teach you this particular formula. I then went on and taught this to graduate students later on because I would take them to the Capitol and really to help them understand the importance of legislative advocacy. It's very intimidating and overwhelming for a lot of people. But I think learning this particular formula helps give you at least a map so that you know exactly what to say and you just sort of plug in your points for each of the components of the formula. So here we go with 3RT. So first of all, I want to emphasize that this is a formula that is useful beyond just the legislative audience or setting. It can actually be helpful to you when working with other power holders, decision makers. And so that can include things like your administration, it can include board members, and it can include anybody, even maybe your PTA, anyone that is making decisions that are related to student groups or your school counseling program that you need to make a case to or make a pitch to. So hopefully you'll see when I show you an example of how that might be the case. The other thing I want to emphasize too is that when you look at the 3RT model, it is one that you can deliver to a specific individual or to a group. So it's one that you could use in a one-on-one conversation or in a meeting, and you can also do it verbally or you could do it in writing. The one that I'm going to show you as an example is one that I did in email recently. So you'll see what that looks like. But again, you could do it in writing or verbally in person. So it's pretty flexible, but I think what it does is it just gives you a framework to work from, because for a lot of people, they just don't know where to get started in terms of what do I say and how do I say it. So hopefully this will give you some strategy around that. So here are the basics of 3RT. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to make your request. When you're talking with stakeholders and policymakers, you don't generally have a lot of time with them. So it's best to just go right in, right up front, and ask for what you want. I see this happen a lot where people will have this sort of really well-crafted argument, and what they are trying to do is they say all these stats and all this research, or they have this very compelling story, and they're trying to lead up to the request that actually comes at the end of their argument. But by the time they even get there, the person that they are trying to make their case to has kind of tuned out or they've gotten distracted or whatever. So I really do believe that this is probably one of the most key pieces of 3RT is that you state your request at the very beginning, and it needs to be a one sentence request. Just make it super crystal clear. You might get some reaction, an emotional reaction, a facial expression, a body expression, posturing, that kind of a thing. And that's okay. Just be ready for that. But it's so important, I think, for people to know immediately what it is that you're asking for. And maybe they're not going to listen for everything that you're going to say after that because they're already not interested, but at least they know where you stand and what you're asking for. Because to lay out a lot of different things and then leave them with a request, you might have already lost them anyway. So state your request right up front. That's the first of the R's. The second R is to provide a rationale. So you might say something like, I would like for you to consider that we would start a gay straight alliance in our school. That might be your request. Your rationale can start off by saying, here are some of the reasons why I think this is important. And then from there, you would provide the substance to back up that request. So you might talk about if you have an idea about how many students in your school identify as LGBTQ, you might be able to provide that information, but you can also provide information about national statistics related to LGBTQ students. For example, you might provide something around suicide rates, things like that. You can provide information about bullying rates of LGBTQ populations, things like that. So you want to say, and here are some reasons why, and then you want to be able to just sort of bullet point those particular things. And if you need to have them on a piece of paper, that's fine. That piece of paper can be what you provide to the person that you're making your case to at the last step. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So make sure that you have something that is substantial, and don't just make it about your opinion, because I think most of the time when we're talking to policymakers, administrators, their language generally is data and research. And so you might have the occasional person who's interested in the anecdotal or personal story, but most people want to know, why is this a bigger issue than just one story? So make sure that you provide them with, I would say, at least 2 or 3 different sort of bullet points in your rationale. Then you want to pause and see if they have any questions and respond to those questions. This is a little bit the tricky part, because you might feel like it's sort of an opportunity for them to come back at you and maybe argue with your point or the request that you're making, and that can happen sometimes. And you might find that they ask you questions that you don't necessarily know the answer to. It's always okay to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I will get back to you because this is very important to me. And just emphasize the fact that this request that you're making is something that you really do care about. So respond to the questions as best you can, but you want to give them an opportunity to ask you questions. And they may sort of indicate that they want to ask questions, but they also may not. So it might be that sometimes you're just going from step 2 to step 4 because it seems like maybe they're sort of closed off to the discussion. And so you just want to skip over and go to step 4. But if it looks like they're somewhat engaged in the issue, then you can say something like, I've given you some information so far. Do you have any questions at this point? Again, you kind of have to use your counseling skills to sort of gauge the level of openness to the conversation there at that third point of whether or not they want to ask questions, and then if they do, then you can respond to them. And then the final step, the T, is just to say thank you. Oftentimes, the people that you are having this conversation with have very little time on their calendar. You might have get 10 minutes with them. So you want to express gratitude for being heard and tell them that you're going to follow up with them. That can be via email. It can be a follow-up phone call. Say, thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. I'm going to follow up with you on this by email in a few days, something to that effect. So make sure that you do say thank you, because oftentimes these are people who don't necessarily have a lot of time on their calendar, and you want to make sure that that you show that appreciation for them making time for you. All right, so that was a lot to absorb, the 3RT, but it is fairly simple to remember, and I think that's the part that's helpful. So I'm going to walk you through this example based on something that I did really recently that was an advocacy kind of action on my part, and I'll sort of explain it to you, and then I'll explain how I use the 3RT, adapted it a little bit as well based on some facts in the particular situation. So I actually had two T's in this case. I had a T at the beginning and a T at the end. And I want to explain that this particular situation is my email to my state board of education representative. And the issue at hand is one that you may have heard of, which is that a number of states are banning the use of critical race theory or anything that suggests that schools talk about race and racism with students in the school setting. And I won't go too deep into the actual issue there, but what I wanted to do was I thought about the fact, certainly from a school counselor perspective, given that I am a former school counselor, I thought about the impact that this kind of ban, and in some places this is becoming legislation, how this is going to impact the mental health of students, families, communities of color, and also employees of color as well. And that it's potentially another form of racism because it is, and having this ban, it is denying their lived experiences, and that can be seen as another form of racism. And what the research tells us is that racism is a mental health issue. So I wanted to make that case to my state Board of Ed representative. Now, in the case of my particular representative, I have done my research in the sense that I know that when the board passed a resolution a few weeks ago related to critical race theory, even though they didn't use that particular term, he was one of two members of the board who opposed the ban. So I started my email by thanking him for opposing the ban, the resolution that would ban critical race theory. And so you'll see that is why I have the first T. Then in my email, I went into the request mode. So again, I'm stating right up front what it is that I'm asking for. And I imagined that perhaps this was an angle that maybe had not been considered. And so I made my request, which was, and I took this straight out of the email, I request that you and your board colleagues consider the impact any further action will have on student mental health. Just made it very general, but hopefully by being general, I've also made it very clear. And then what I did in my rationale was I wrote a paragraph. That was too long to include on a slide. But in that paragraph, I cited research that is about the fact that racism is a mental health issue, including for children. That mental health impacts student achievement because we know that the Board of Education is going to be concerned about student achievement, and about the need for mental health support in schools, which of course points to school counselors. And some of you know that last year in the budget, there was $25 million that was allocated to hire more school counselors. That action item or that budget line item was never realized because of the pandemic. And so not only do we need that $25 million for more school counseling jobs now because of the pandemic, but I made an argument that if this resolution goes any further, and for example, if it becomes legislation, then we certainly are going to need more school counselors because we're going to have more mental health issues. It's not necessarily the way that I want to ask for more school counselors, but I think the mental health angle is something for them to consider. So I provided rationale. In my email, I also provided copies of the citations that I made in the paragraph. So I attached those to the email. And then at number 4, which I would be the respond. And now here in the email, I'm obviously not having a live conversation with him. So I make sure that there is an opportunity for him to respond to me. He can obviously email me back, but I also provided my phone number in case he had questions and he wanted to contact me that way. And then finally, I did a thank you and a follow-up statement. So I said, please contact me if you need additional sources. And I just another thank you for considering this request and his support. Kind of circled back to the very first thank you again. So anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea about what the 3RT can look like, slightly adapted for email and specific to this particular scenario. All right, that is it with Pitch Your Idea with 3RT. I know it was a short presentation, but I really hope that this particular formula is helpful to you because it's pretty short, pretty simple, but is a good way to package any request or idea that you have that you want to make with decision makers, and gives you a little bit more confidence when you go into things, because if you want to kind of get what you're going to say in your head, 3RT is really a good way to get that in your head and, like I said, feel a little more organized going into your conversation.